The president has, you've seen the picture of the woman's body with the writing and the president's signature. The president says that's not his. Okay? The president says it's not his. The Republican colleagues say it's not his. The administration say it's not his. Will you be opening up an investigation into the Epstein estate for putting out a fake document with the president's signature linking him to the world's largest pedophile ring? Will you be opening that investigation into that?
It was a 9-word question. That is all it took. 9 words that Kash Patel, the man who had spent the better part of a decade positioning himself as the person who would finally tear open the Epstein files and expose the truth, had no answer for. Not because the answer was classified, not because his lawyers stopped him, but because the question had been constructed with such precision, using nothing but the administration's own public statements, that any answer Patel gave would detonate something. He had 2 choices. He could say no and hand Democrats proof that the White House's own forgery claims were not worth investigating. Or he could say yes and commit the FBI to opening a forensic investigation into a document bearing what multiple independent news organizations had already confirmed looked like Donald Trump's signature. Congressman Jared Moskowitz from Florida already knew which answer was coming. That was the point. Watch this video to the end, because what unfolded in that hearing room on September 17th was not the dramatic document-waving, table-slamming confrontation that fills social media clips and ends careers in 90 seconds. It was something more methodical and ultimately more dangerous than that. It was a trap built from receipts, and by the time Patel understood the architecture of what Moskowitz had constructed, he was already inside it. To understand why the exchange hit the way it did, you have to go back to where Moskowitz started, and it was not where anyone expected. He did not open with Epstein. He did not open with Trump or signatures or documents. He opened with something that almost no one in that room was prepared to hear from a Democratic congressman with 5 minutes on the clock and an FBI director sitting across from him. He started by saying it out loud: political violence and extremism are not exclusive to one party. The building they were sitting in had been the site of a riot organized by people who supported the current president. He was not going to sit there while the entire left got painted with one brush when he knew, and everyone in that room knew, that the extremes existed on both sides, and that pretending otherwise was exactly why nothing in Washington ever got solved. It was a calculated disarmament, and it worked, because what followed required everyone in the room, on both sides, to listen without the defensive reflex that dominates these hearings. Moskowitz had signaled that he was not there to perform. He was there to establish a record. Moskowitz then reconstructed the arc of the Epstein promise in terms so precise and so methodically unflattering that it was difficult to watch the people in that room pretend they had not been paying attention. He laid it out beat by beat. Kash Patel nominated to lead the FBI. Dan Bongino nominated as his deputy. The celebration from a certain corner of the internet that had been promised for years, that the Epstein files contained a secret list of powerful men who had been protected from accountability by every prior administration. The white binders, Phase 1, the podcasts, the names that were finally going to come out, then Attorney General Pam Bondi standing before cameras and saying the list was on her desk, and then weeks later a Department of Justice memo that arrived without fanfare and delivered a conclusion that directly contradicted everything the promise had been built on. There was no list. The conspiracy theories around Epstein, the memo explained, were not supported by the evidence the federal government actually possessed. Moskowitz let that sequence settle for a moment. Then he asked Patel the question that the previous day's Senate testimony had already partially answered. According to the evidence the FBI holds, according to what the Bureau actually has in its possession, how many names are on the Epstein client list beyond those who had already been charged? Patel said 0. Moskowitz repeated it back to him to make sure the record was clear. Other than Epstein himself and Ghislaine Maxwell, the FBI director's testimony offered under oath in the Senate the previous day and now confirmed in the House, was that the number of individuals against whom credible evidence existed of involvement in Epstein's trafficking operation was 0. The list that had been promised, the list that had been the organizing promise of an entire political movement's relationship with the Epstein story, the list that had been described as sitting on the Attorney General's desk, contained no names that the FBI was either able or willing to provide. If you've been following this story closely and you want to make sure you catch every development as it comes, now is a good moment to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happens in the next several weeks of hearings and subpoenas and depositions will not make sense without the foundation that Moskowitz built in that room on September 17th, and the story is far from finished. Moskowitz then pivoted. He had established the 0. He had documented the gap between what had been promised and what the evidence actually supported. Now he moved to the piece of the Epstein file that had consumed Washington for the previous 6 weeks, more than almost any other single document in the entire disclosure process: the birthday book. The 3-volume album that Ghislaine Maxwell had assembled for Epstein's 50th birthday in 2003, soliciting photographs, drawings, and personal notes from the people in Epstein's life. The book that the House Oversight Committee had subpoenaed from Epstein's estate. The book that had arrived in response to that subpoena and been released publicly by Democratic members of the committee in September 2025, and specifically the single page within that book that featured the outline of a woman's body drawn in heavy marker, several lines of typewritten text imagining a private conversation between two people who described themselves as sharing something in common, a closing line reading "May every day be another wonderful secret," and a signature in cursive below the drawing that read Donald. Trump had been denying the letter's existence since July 2025, when the Wall Street Journal first reported on it. He had filed a lawsuit against the newspaper seeking $10 billion in damages for defamation. He had called the story fake, called the letter fake, told reporters he had never drawn a picture of a woman in his life. The White House press secretary had posted that the letter was fake news to perpetuate a Democrat Epstein hoax. The deputy White House chief of staff had posted comparisons of Trump's official signature to the cursive Donald on the birthday page and argued they did not match. Multiple Republican members of the House Oversight Committee had stood in front of cameras and said they believed the president when he said the signature was not his. The problem with all of that was the chain of custody. The birthday book had not arrived at the House Oversight Committee through a leak or an anonymous tip or a document obtained under circumstances that could be challenged. It had arrived because the committee had subpoenaed Epstein's estate, and the estate had complied with that subpoena and produced the book in response to a lawful congressional demand. The chain of custody ran from Epstein's personal possession to a legal production pursuant to a federal subpoena, for the signature to be fake, for the letter to be the forgery that the White House was claiming it was. Someone would have had to place a forged document inside Jeffrey Epstein's private collection at some point before his death in 2019, and hope that it would survive the subsequent years of legal proceedings in estate management and congressional investigation, and eventually surface in a way that damaged the man who was currently President of the United States. That was the theory that was being officially advanced by the White House. The Wall Street Journal had compared the signature to examples of Trump's personal correspondence from the 1990s and early 2000s and found them substantially similar. The New York Times had independently made the same comparison and reached the same conclusion. A 1996 letter to then New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani, a 1995 letter to a Palm Beach commissioner, a 1999 note to CNN host Larry King following his father's death. All of them featured a cursive first-name signature style that matched what was on the birthday page to a degree that multiple handwriting analysts had noted was not easily explained by coincidence. Trump had also inscribed a copy of his own book with the words "Jeff, you are the greatest," signed and dated in a hand that bore the same resemblance. Someone, the White House's theory required, had forged all of those too. Moskowitz laid none of this out explicitly. He did not need to. Everyone in the hearing room had been following the story. He simply asked Patel whether he had seen the image, the picture of the woman's body with the writing and what appeared to be the president's signature. Patel acknowledged he had. Moskowitz said the president claimed the signature was not his, that the Republican colleagues on the committee agreed, that the administration had said the same. He let that consensus sit for precisely 1 second, and then he asked the question that the entire preceding 2 minutes had been building toward. Will you be opening an investigation into the Epstein estate for putting out a fake document with the president's signature linking him to the world's largest pedophile ring? Patel paused. He said, on what basis? Moskowitz did not hesitate. He said the basis was that they had literally put out a fake document according to the president with a fake signature, and that constituted a forgery of the signature of the President of the United States. That was the basis. Patel said sure, he would do it. The room absorbed that for a moment. Moskowitz said he looked forward to that investigation, and then his time expired. What had just happened was not a dramatic revelation in the conventional sense. There were no classified documents, no whistleblower testimony, no internal memos exposing a pattern of obstruction. What had happened was something structurally different, and in its own way more significant. Moskowitz had walked the FBI director into a corner constructed entirely from the Trump administration's own claims, and asked him to make them official. The White House had been saying for weeks that the signature on the birthday book was fake. Republican members of the committee had been saying the same. The official party line, stated repeatedly and publicly by the most powerful people in the executive branch, was that a document subpoenaed from the Epstein estate under congressional authority was a forgery. Moskowitz had simply asked the FBI director whether the federal government was prepared to treat that claim the way the federal government is required to treat any claim of that kind, as the basis for a criminal investigation. Patel said yes, and the implications of that yes were more complicated than they first appeared. If the FBI opens an investigation into whether the signature on the Epstein birthday book is genuine, that investigation will require forensic analysis of the signature itself. It will require comparison with known authentic examples of Trump's handwriting. It will require expert testimony from document examiners about whether the signature on the birthday page matches or does not match the extensive record of Trump's personal correspondence from the same period. The Wall Street Journal's analysis, the New York Times' analysis, the multiple comparisons drawn from letters Trump signed in the mid-1990s through the mid-2000s, all of that will become part of the evidentiary record of a federal investigation that the FBI director has now committed to opening at the request of the president himself. Whatever that investigation concludes, it will conclude under oath, on the record, in a form that carries legal weight. If the signature is genuine, the investigation will establish that. If it cannot be determined either way, the investigation will establish that. And if the investigation finds evidence of actual forgery, the investigation will establish that. There is no version of this where the inquiry simply disappears. That is the trap that Moskowitz built, and it was constructed with the kind of precision that only becomes visible in retrospect. He had not demanded the investigation himself. He had asked whether the FBI director would open one based on the president's own claims. The framing was impeccable. If Patel said no, the president's allies would have to explain why the FBI was declining to investigate a forgery of the president's signature. If Patel said yes, as he did, then the administration had just formally requested a federal forensic investigation into a document that multiple independent news organizations had already concluded bore a signature consistent with decades of Trump's personal correspondence. Either answer created a problem. Patel chose the one that created a more manageable problem in the short term, and a potentially far more consequential one over time. What the exchange accomplished was something more specific. It put into the congressional record, under oath, the precise gap between the promise and the reality. It established that the people who had made the promise, or who had benefited politically from the promise being widely believed, were now in control of the institutions responsible for the investigation, and that their own director had testified that the investigation yielded nothing that the promise had described. That is not the end of the Epstein story in any institutional sense. Investigations continue, documents continue to be reviewed, and the birthday book forensic inquiry that Patel committed to will produce conclusions that will be examined carefully by people on every side of this debate. But as an accounting of what had been claimed, and what had been delivered, the zero was definitive. The hearing room had been in session for hours by the time Moskowitz asked his questions. What made the exchange different from dozens of prior Epstein questions that day was its architecture. It did not ask Patel to admit wrongdoing, or present classified documents. It simply assembled the public record in order and asked the man at the witness table whether he was prepared to follow his own stated logic to its institutional conclusion. The white binders were never filled. The list was never produced. The Phase 2 that had been promised arrived as a memo explaining there was nothing to release, and the birthday book that the president called a forgery now had a federal investigation attached to it at the FBI director's own confirmation. When Moskowitz's time expired, the chamber cleared quickly. The exchange would be replayed and analyzed at length in the days that followed. Legal scholars would note the specific legal implications of an FBI director committing to open a forgery investigation based on the president's own public statements. Journalists would revisit the Wall Street Journal and New York Times signature analyses alongside Patel's confirmation, and somewhere in the administrative structure of the bureau that Patel led, a file would be opened, and the work of determining whether a signature on a birthday page was genuine would begin, at the specific request of the man whose name appeared above it. That investigation will take time. Its conclusions will not arrive quickly or without controversy, but it will conclude, and when it does, the record of how it started will trace directly back to a hearing room in September 2025, a congressman from Florida, and a 22-word answer that turned the administration's own public claims into the official basis for a federal investigation.